So we talked a little bit about Wednesday about some of the things that England was doing that was putting pressure on the colonies, making taxes that were going to be difficult to live with and taxing things that were hardships for the colonial people, the things that they were producing, but also the things that they were making out of the things that they were producing, and then requiring them to purchase a stamp just so they could sell the things that they were producing. And then also parking troops in the colonies, which sent an irrevocable message of, you know, you're not us. We are in charge of you, but you are not one of us. We require troops to guard you, as opposed to you being British citizens. You are Americans, which is something different, and we need soldiers to guard you, which sent kind of an ugly message. But the truth of the matter is, even with all of that pressure, fighting back probably is not the best move for the colonists. I mean, when you look at the military strength of Britain versus the military strength of America, when you look at the fact that Britain has access to all the military supplies and America doesn't, that what America has is what America grows, and they've been set up as cash crop colonies, so they're not really even that self-sustaining. When you think about it in those terms, fighting back really doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but they do fight back. So I want to take a look at probably one of the reasons why they fight back. And in order to understand that, you have to understand this thing that's happening in Europe at the time, which is Enlightenment thinking. Okay, so this is a picture of a window overlooking a market. And it's a picture of the window of a man named Adam Smith overlooking a marketplace. Adam Smith, as a young man, used to sit in his window every day and look out over the marketplace and watch these transactions going back and forth. People would be talking about the weather or how dry the roads are or how old somebody's kid is getting. But what was happening with their hands was that they were handing money to somebody and receiving a product in return. And all of that was happening secondarily, like silently. Not silently, but it wasn't the language that was being spoken, but everybody agreed to it. And he was watching that happen, and he was like, there's something here. There's something sort of miraculous here. This whole language that we speak about the market. And so as he grew up, he started to explore that idea sort of from a scientific perspective. Adam Smith was born right in the middle of the scientific revolution. And in the middle of the scientific revolution, it was kicked off by Isaac Newton publishing laws of physics. It's arguably kicked off by Isaac Newton and the apple, but that didn't probably actually really happen. So the idea that you could actually solve scientific questions by doing experiments and searching for knowledge that meant that you could understand the whole universe. Scientists began to believe that any answer could be found using the scientific method. And people took that and then applied it to society. If science can solve any question, if you can answer questions about gravity or about physics or about weather or about, how species grow and all this, surely you can also use the scientific method to answer why people form societies the way that they do. And so in the middle of that was born this group of people called social scientists. And don't get confused, it's not socialism. Social scientists meant scientists that focused on society. One of these was Thomas Hobbes. Thomas Hobbes said that human life by itself was nasty, brutish, and short. And he wrote a book called Leviathan. And I just want you to take a look at this picture. What do you see here? Can anybody make out what this is? Can you see what this is?
Is that supposed to be the king of England or?
Well, it could have been the king of England. It could have been the king of anything. The point is that it is a king. But can you see what it's made out of? Just out of curiosity.
I think it's people or?
Right. Very good. The king is made out of other people. So you are only a ruler if you are made out of other people. Your kingdom is made of people. So the Leviathan that he's talking about here is not a sea monster. It's a man made of men. And that's how a society is built. You build it out of people. And therefore, humans form societies because they're afraid. They band together because they're scared. And once they are in that society, they expect protection from the strong. So a king's responsibility is to protect the people that make him a king. John Locke, that was 1651 and 1690, John Locke took that and took it in a completely in another direction. He said that those men that make up that man made out of men are born as clean slates. They're not fundamentally evil or good. They're just blank slates, but they know that they have the right to life. They have the right to live. They have the right to be free, and they have the right to do something for themselves to gain property. So each one of these little men made out of men, each one of these men that make up the king, has the right to life, liberty, and property. Life, liberty, and property. That's what John Locke said. And that the reason that people build societies is because they are protecting those rights, their right to live, their right to be free, their right to own property. And the king owes them the right to those things. If a king gets in the way of your right to life, liberty, and property, then he needs to be thrown out. That was in 1690. And people began to really coalesce around these ideas. They started to gather in people's parlors in France and have conversations over tea and wine about what life, liberty, and property actually meant. Well, this was when Adam Smith started to write, that little boy from above the market. He took that thing that he saw happening where people spoke invisibly about the transactions in the market. And he said he believed that people have a sixth sense about right and wrong. They're not just blank. They know that things are right and they know that things are wrong. And if we were physically in the classroom right now, I'd do a demonstration to show you that even you have a sense of right and wrong. And I regret that I don't get to do that today because we're sitting here on Zoom. But I guess you can kind of imagine it. We imagine that we're sitting in a small group instead of sitting on Zoom, and I'm walking around the room and I'm teaching, and I accidentally trip over Angel's foot, and I fall and I crack my face, and I hit my head on the floor and I'm bleeding everywhere. Just imagine that for a minute. Okay, that's terrible. I know. I feel, your compassion in your heart. Now imagine for a minute that the same thing is happening. I'm walking around and I'm teaching, and Joseph sticks out his foot and trips me on purpose, but I catch myself and I don't fall. Now, in which of those two scenarios, which one of those two, Angel, who tripped me on accident, or Joseph, who tripped me on purpose, which one of them is more wrong? What do y'all think?
Tripping on purpose.
Okay, all right. But, Dalen, when I was tripped on accident, I was badly hurt. So why is being tripped on purpose worse if I didn't actually get hurt?
Because he had the intent to hurt you.
He had the intent to hurt me, but he didn't hurt me. So doesn't it matter what his intentions were if it didn't work out?
No.
It does matter. That's how you know you have a sense of right and wrong. You have that moral code inside you. That's what Adam Smith was talking about. You know, for some reason, even though it's not measurable, if we were dogs or cats, we wouldn't measure it that way. We'd measure it by the harm done. But in our core, we know that some things are wrong and some things are right, and it has to do with intent. Exactly like you were saying. Good job, Dalen. People have a sixth sense about right and wrong. People don't like to do wrong, and that's why people build societies, is what Adam Smith said in 1759. So 1759, pay attention to the year, because what's happening over in America is at this moment, the king is taking out is launching an attack on France in the colonies using British colonial militia, and they're getting killed to defend British holdings in America. But that's not mostly what Adam Smith was writing about. When he was writing about this, mostly what he was writing about, the things that bothered him in the market were when people didn't have the ability to exercise their sense of right and wrong because governmental forces got in their way and forced them to do things one way or the other. So he wrote a book in 1776 called The Wealth of Nations. And this book, he basically put out a case that said, if everybody just takes their hands off and people just produce what they're good at producing and sell what they're good at selling, the market will take care of the rest. The free hand of the market will make it all come out well. The wealthy will rise to the top and spend their wealth. And then because they're spending their wealth, the poor people will rise up and the whole society will lift. But if you keep making things come out in favor of the rich or making things come out for the welfare of the poor, then it's going to get screwed up. Mostly what he was talking about when he was writing about this was the East India Company. And we talked a little bit about this on Wednesday. The East India Company was a huge complicated structure. It was 67,000 private soldiers. It had an army of a whole fleet of ships, and most of the members of parliament had stock in the East India Company. So it had a completely unchecked authority in India. It could do whatever it wanted to do to India because it had no government oversight, and the oversight that it had were people that owned stock in it anyway. And it had its own private army, 67,000 troops. And when they moved into an area, like I said, when we moved into an area, they created their own trading base in that area, and then they sent their troops out to take over the area and take away the basic liberties of the people around that area. And so whole chunks of India were basically coming under the rule of the East India Company. At the time, because they were kind of crumbling under their own weight, they were holding 17 million pounds of unsold tea, and they were about to go bankrupt. If they went bankrupt, they were going to take most of England with them. 17 million pounds of unsold tea that they had to sell and get rid of. So you're the King of England. You're watching most of your noblemen freak out about the fact that they have all this unsold tea. What do you do about it? Who can you force to buy that tea? Let's think. In 1773, the Crown passed what was called the Tea Act. The East India Company was given access to trade directly with the colonists, which made it so that colonial merchants, colonial tea sellers were undercut. Then they were guaranteed sales and they held a monopoly. So you had to buy your tea from the East India Company if you were living in the American colonies. So the tea was actually cheaper, even with this tax, even with the tax that was on it already. Tea is actually cheaper to buy. But the colonials, who didn't rebel against the Tea Act in 1770, rebelled against this one because it came from the East India Company, because they knew that what would happen if they had to buy their tea from the East India Company was that the East India Company would set up shop and take over and remove their basic liberties the way that they had done in India, and that the Crown would let them. The Crown would let them march their troops in and have martial law of the East India Company, merchant martial law, and the colonials would lose any rights that they had. So they did rebel. Now, they've already started to set up a network of communication. They did this after the Boston Massacre, which we talked about on Wednesday. They started to set up committees of correspondence, which are basically small groups whose job it is to keep the word spreading. And of course, one of the words that they spread was that picture that we saw of the Boston Massacre, but other things too, to keep each other apprised of what the British government was up to in the colonies. And pretty soon, all of these committees are open throughout the colonies, and they're all talking to each other. Eventually, those committees are going to become the ruling group of people in the colonies, people who are making legislative decisions, because they're already set up to do that. They're already talking to each other. They might as well go ahead and be in charge. And these committees of correspondence are Benjamin Franklin and Sam Adams and John Adams. And these are being formed by these people who have, really made America their own. The Sons of Liberty protest the Tea Act by engaging in an active colonial rebellion. They dress up as Indians, and who it was that actually did it, there are people that were definitely there, but all you really need to know is that it was the Sons of Liberty. The governor of Boston had forced, who was a king-appointed governor, had forced the East India ships to be allowed to come into harbor. And as a result, Sons of Liberty, dressed up as, Native Americans, snuck onto the ships and dumped 342 chests of tea into the harbor. That doesn't sound like a big deal until you start to actually tally up the numbers. We're talking about 10,000 pounds, and not pounds of tea, like pounds of dollars. 10,000 pounds sterling. So 10,000 pounds of cost to the East India Company in that day would have added up to about $1.5 million of damage today. Those 642 chests of tea overboard would have been $1.5 million. And as a result of this act, copycat tea parties happened throughout the colonies. In all the little port cities, they went out to the harbor and they dumped tea overboard. This is just the one that you hear about the most. So is this an act of terrorism? What do y'all think? I'm going to stop my share and see who's still with me. Is this an act of economic terrorism? What do you think? No?
One country's terrorist is another country's freedom fighters. So honestly, you can't really say one or the other. It's all subjective.
Well, okay, but by definition, a terrorist act is an act that's supposed to make you afraid to do something, right? So was this just to damage the East India Company, or was it to make them afraid of trading with the colonies?
Well, that's the thing. Did the Sons of Liberty do any damage to the people that worked for the East India Company, or just damage the goods they were trying to trade?
Yeah, no, just damage to the goods. And it's not like they ran out of tea. They had tea. They just couldn't sell it because the East India Company had a monopoly. So this is an act of economic rebellion that cost, millions of dollars in damage eventually, starting with the $1.5 million worth of damage to this one Tea Party, and then with the rolling Tea Parties that happened afterwards. So yeah, I agree with you. I think that they're freedom fighters, not terrorists, but there are definitely people who will argue that point with me. Do I have the PowerPoint back up?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Okay. In response to this act of rebellion, the king declared what were called the intolerable acts. These acts closed the ports of Boston, closed in police town meetings. They sent in troops specifically to enforce the Tea Act, and then they also expanded the Quartering Act, which was so that the government of the town had to provide a housing place for the British troops to live while they were policing the town. But now British troops can just move into people's houses. The expansion of the Quartering Act. And this is a political cartoon from the time. This is America. This is Boston or America, depending on how you look at it, having tea pushed down her throat and being just ravaged by, this is supposed to be a representative of the British Prime Minister. So this was a cartoon that was published by those committees of correspondence. In 1774, the committees of correspondence came together and had what was called the First Continental Congress. It's important to note that at this point, we're still not talking about independence. We're not talking about asking for independence. The First Continental Congress met in Philadelphia, and every colony except Georgia showed up. It was led by Samuel Adams, George Washington, and Patrick Henry, but John Adams was the one that did a lot of the speaking. Conservatives who were there wanted a looser home rule. They wanted to go back to the way things were before. If you remember, before the war, but before the French and Indian War, the colonies had what was called salutary neglect. They were able to kind of do what they did, and whatever happened, happened. And there were laws, but the English didn't waste a lot of time enforcing them. Salutary neglect, let's just go back to that. The conservatives, that's all they wanted. Just take your hands off our market, stop passing acts that cost us more than they cost you. Just let us get back to the way things were. The radicals wanted something called home rule. And home rule means that we establish our own governments. We technically belong to England, but we establish our own government and we make our own trading laws and our own trading treaties. And then we come to England and we continue to be a part of England. We still pay taxes to England, but we rule ourselves. Now, there's already a precedent for this because Scotland has home rule at this time. Scotland has negotiated with England so that they get to be in charge of themselves. They have their own parliament, they make their own treaties, but England is technically still the crown over them. So that's what the radicals want. They want home rule. The conservatives want salutary neglect to come back. The radicals want home rule. Nobody's asking for independence at this point. Independence isn't even a thought. The only thing they can finally agree on is that they're going to have a non-importation, non-exportation agreement, which is basically a boycott. We agree as the colonies that we will not buy any products from England, and England will not buy any products from us. We're just going to refuse to participate in trade with England. And that's all that they did. In 1775, the king started to act as though the colonies might be in rebellion. And one of the first things that often happens when a a military force realizes that the local militia might not be on their side is that they come and start to try to take their weapons away. So in April of 1775, one of the things that was established by this First Continental Congress was an agreement that if the general of the British forces, who was parked here in Boston, if he started to march towards where the military supplies were being kept, the munitions and the colonial, their guns, where their guns were being stored. If he started to march troops in that direction, they would stop him. Other than they would assume that that it was an attack, that any troops marching towards where the militia were quartered was an attack. And so they set themselves up to warn if that happened. So we have a person watching at the Old North Church, and his job is to light one lantern if General Gage is going to march by sea or by land, and two if he's going to march by sea. And that's his whole job, is to sit up there and watch. And as soon as that happens, as soon as the British forces start to march towards where the munitions are held, he lights two lanterns, no, one lantern, because they're coming by land, and horsemen set off riding through the villages to round up the militia and say, get down there, that's happening right now. And that's the famous ride of Paul Revere. So in April of 1775, this actually happened. General Gage? What is it? Yeah, General Gage marches his troops down the road with the intention of going to Concord, where the militia is keeping all their weapons. And they are met en route at every bridge by militia. They have big fights all along the way. And as a result, General Gage has to turn around and come back. 1,700 troops march back without the militia, without the weapons. So it has officially happened now. England has sent troops to seize the weapons of the militia. The Second Continental Congress is a little more well-attended than the First Continental Congress was. They're still not asking for home rule, or for independence. They're still just asking for home rule. They've given up on this idea of salutary neglect, but they're still not asking for independence. What they do is they appoint somebody to be in charge of their military. They appoint George Washington to command the military of all the colonies. And they begin to raise funds for a continental army and a continental navy. This is going to solidify all of these little militias into one military identity, and that's going to be unified under George Washington. They're still not declaring independence, though. Very important. And they're still not sure exactly what they do want to do. They still don't agree, but they are voting on a levy. This is probably a moment in the Patriot that people have seen. They're voting to send troops and money towards a continental army. General George Washington is the person that they appoint. He's very popular because he's from the South. He's from Virginia, but he fought in the French and Indian Wars in the armies in the Ohio River Valley, using militia from up and down the colony. So he's already kind of got a little bit of popularity across the board. He's considered a war hero, even though you saw those battles. He lost the big one that he fought, but he's well liked, he's well trusted, he's intelligent, and he inspires people. He's not actually a military genius in any way, shape, or form. Like, if you look at his military history, he's all right, but he's not brilliant. But he knows how to ask for brilliance. He knows how to appoint people who will be brilliant, and he unites those people. So most of the authority of the committees of correspondence in the Continental Congress are coming from those New England colonies like Boston and New York. He is coming from the Chesapeake. So he is, as military commander, bringing the Chesapeake Bay colonies and the Massachusetts Bay colonies together. Okay? So that's why they choose General George Washington. In June of 1775, this new Continental Army, led by George Washington, took command of a hill in Charleston Harbor, and that was called Bunker Hill. That hill in Boston Harbor is right on the port of Boston, so it's a really good military holding, I guess. It's a good place to hold. This is Bunker Hill, and as an act of discipline, 3,000 redcoats attacked the forces just because they were there, because they had decided to take a position on this hill. The redcoats attacked them. They marched 3,000 British regulars straight up the hill. I mean, at that point, the Continental Army didn't even really have to shoot them. They just had to throw things at them. They were marching straight up the hill in a straight line right into enemy fire. The colonists basically sat up there and mowed down the British soldiers until they ran out of ammunition. The only reason that they had to leave the hill is because they literally ran out of bullets. They literally ran out of ammunition. So they retreated, but by the time they retreated, the British had taken such heavy losses that it's not considered a win for the British either. In January of 1776, as a result of that, in August of 1775, so that happened in June, in August, the king officially declared the colonies in rebellion. Do I have that here? No, I don't. Okay. So we're still in 1775. We still haven't declared independence, but at this point, the king has decided that the colonies are in full rebellion and will need to be fought as though they were fighting for independence. In January of 1776, one of these Enlightenment thinkers that we were talking about at the beginning, one of these Enlightenment thinkers, Thomas Paine, released a document called Common Sense. And he took all of the arguments against independence and he shot them down. So that's the document that I have for you to read today. And I don't have you reading the whole document because it's like a novel. I just have you reading a couple of excerpts from it. So let's just take a look at that real quick. Let me get into that. Let me share something different. Instead of my PowerPoint, I'll share my screen. Okay, so under your class materials for this week, Assembling the Nation, The Road to Revolution, you have a document, Thomas Paine's Common Sense. Okay, let me open this a little bit bigger. In this document, you'll see places where he says, but she has protected us, say some. And he's talking, he's talking about is England. And that she has protected us, but she would have defended other places for the same reason. England is like our parents. Britain is our parent country, say some. Then shame upon her. Even brutes don't devour their own young, or savages make war upon their own families. So basically what he does is he takes each argument, like we are not strong enough, we don't have the military advantages, and he shoots them down. So I want you to take a look at this document. I'm not going to ask you a question about it this week because the context is not there yet, but probably you'll end up answering a question about it on an exam. And the part that your whole semester project is based on is here. Harmony and reconciliation, how important it is, because any fracture that we have at the beginning will be a huge gaping wound later. So your fracture project, the words for your fracture project are in here too. So make sure you take a look at this document, this Common Sense by Thomas Paine. But he uses that Enlightenment thinking. We have the right to life, to liberty, to the pursuit of property. We have the right to expect our king to protect us. We have the right to exist in this society that we build. We have those rights. And then he suggests the possibility that in Common Sense, his argument is, well, if we one of the arguments that he makes is, if we separate from England, then we'll have to appoint our own king. And who will be our king? It won't be somebody who's anointed by the Pope. It won't be a divinely appointed king. And he says, on the day that we do to establish ourselves as a country, let's take the law and put the law front and center. And you can even put a crown on it if you want to, but the law will be our king and nothing else. So that's radical in a world that is almost entirely governed by actual kings, to suggest the possibility that a country could start without one, that a country could start not having one. In January of 1776, Common Sense comes out. In February, England blockades all the American ports. In March of 1776, Adam Smith publishes The Wealth of Nations, which suggests that American colonies should be like Scottish colonies and be allowed to trade however they want. And from April to June, almost all of the colonies write their own petitions of independence. So this document has a profound effect on all of the colonies because they start to talk about independence for the first time. And in June of 1776, the Continental Congress drafts a Declaration of Independence. They get Thomas Jefferson to write it, and we'll talk more about Thomas Jefferson specifically later because he's fascinating. They get Thomas Jefferson to write it. It went through several drafts. In order for everybody to agree on it, whole sections had to be rewritten. There was initially a section that that had to do with abolishing slavery that had to be removed in order for the Southern colonies to agree to it. So he completed it on July the 2nd. On July the 4th, they adopted it and signed it and sent it off on August the 2nd to the king. So the opening part of the Declaration of Independence says, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and that all men have the inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, because even Thomas Jefferson recognized that not everybody ends up with property, but the pursuit of happiness is what he changed it to. So that Enlightenment thinking that we saw all the way back at the beginning, this is the end result of that Enlightenment thinking, is this declaration that takes John Locke's ideas and Adam Smith's ideas and then coalesces them into Thomas Paine's ideas. And then that becomes the Declaration of Independence. Now we are officially seeking to fight off Britain and become actually independent. Okay? Y'all have any questions about any of that stuff? Wow, I got through that fast. I'm looking at the clock and I'm like, wow, I just sped right through it. Okay. All right. So let's see who's still here. Raise your hand or open your camera or something so I can see who's still here. Okay, so let's have a little bit of a conversation about this. How do these ideas that the Enlightenment thinkers, there's right and wrong, there's you have the right to be protected by your government, protected by your king, you have the right to pursue property or pursue happiness. How do these ideas make it worthwhile to fight off Britain? What do y'all think?
Like, I suppose these new ideas connected with the people who wanted change, and they felt as though if these new ideas were speaking about them.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And these people being people who are being hit the hardest by these taxes, by these monopolies, and the fear of the East India Company troops coming marching in and taking over their colonies.
Yeah.
I think for me, it would have been the moment when British troops started to roll into town. Like, nothing makes you feel like you're not really a citizen, like having troops whose job it is to make you behave like a citizen. Like, that to me is the biggest evidence that the king had stopped thinking of these as his people. And we're not talking about a small number of troops here. There's 38,000 troops that were brought into the harbors of the Chesapeake and the Massachusetts Bay Harbor, that were brought in specifically to guard the colonists from their own actions. There's no French imposition. There's no, the natives aren't attacking on the frontiers right now. I mean, they probably are, but that's not what the troops are there for. They're there to police the colonists. So the king is no longer protecting the people that make him. The man made out of men is not protecting the people who are making him anymore. Okay, so what I'd like you to do for an assignment today, let me get this up and running here. What I'd like you to do is argue for the things that came before independence. So if you were part of one of those two first or second Continental Congresses, which would you think would be a better solution? Home rule or salutary neglect? I want you to try to understand what it was that they were arguing for. So until 1776, the Americans weren't even thinking about asking for independence. They either wanted things to return to salutary neglect, or where they just went about their business and were left alone, or to a state of home rule where they belonged to England but had their own parliament and their own government and their own responsibilities. So what I want you to do is I want you to write for which one of those two circumstances would have been better, understanding that independence hadn't even occurred to them yet. And just while you're writing that, just try to imagine, as a citizen of the colonies, which one of these two evils would be the better one to settle for, because independence is just too far-fetched. There's just no way that you could just be free. There's just no way that you could be independent. That's a dream that's never going to happen. So which one of these two lesser things would you want to settle for, and which one do you think would be better? So that's the paragraph I want you to write. Doesn't have to be very long. Same short little paragraph that you've been writing. But that should be available to y'all now. And both of these assignments are going to be due Sunday at midnight. Again, if you're having technology issues, I don't want you to freak out about that. They will still be there when the technology gets ironed back out again, and you can catch them up later. But go ahead and get it out of the way if you can. Okay? Any questions about the assignments? And next week, we will have the Revolutionary War. We'll go ahead and go to war. Let's have the war. Should we have a war? Let's have a war. So next week we'll have a Revolutionary War, and then next week will be your first exam. And we'll talk a little bit about how that's going to work. It's not going to be hard on you, because you're going to be able to take it in your own time, but it's not going to be horribly stressful, I hope. But we'll talk about it, so that if you have any questions about how to take an exam and everything, that'll be next week. But let's have the Revolutionary War first.